Our next speaker is Tomas Palenicek on the effects of psilocybin on perception and the dynamics of induced EEG and fMRI correlates of psychedelic experience. Tomas Palenicek, MD and PhD, is a principal investigator of the first ongoing clinical trial in the Czech Republic studying the neurobiology of the psilocybin's effect on human volunteers. Tomas's past work has included preclinical research of MDMA, LSD, mescaline, psilocin, and 2CB, as well as the role as principal investigator of the first Czech human cannabis study examining its acute effects in healthy volunteers. Please welcome Tomas.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you that you let me present results of our work that we perform currently in Czech Republic. Thank you for introducing me. I will just try to a little bit update my name. My name is Tomas Palenicek. I know it's very difficult for most people to pronounce. I'm very happy to present you here the results of the clinical trial that we are currently running still in Czech Republic with psilocybin in human volunteers. I would like to mention a little bit of the history. Czech Republic in the history was a country where there was a lot of psychedelic research. There's recently published a book of Dr. Hausner, who treated hundreds of patients with LSD in Satská clinic, and actually also LSD was produced in Czech Republic, and this is LSD that was produced by Spofa in 50s and 60s, and it's not the only box which is on the photograph. There are some boxes still existing in between people. There were quite a lot of researchers and therapeutics who used psychedelics in Czech Republic in the past. Probably most of you have heard about Stanislav Gross, who also worked in the same institution, but it was in the history called Research Psychiatric Institute. Then we transformed to Prague Psychiatric Institute, Prague Psychiatric Center, and now we are National Institute of Mental Health. Here we are together with Stan Grove, with some of the people from our team. Okay, when we move on to what psychedelic research and psychedelic use could be, there are several approaches. There's definitely the psychomimetic approach that was used also during the period when psychedelics were not able to be used in the treatment. In the past, the psycholytic and psychedelic therapy has been well established in the past, and now it's gaining again attention. To start clinical trials with psychedelics in Czech Republic was also an issue. It wasn't that easy as it might look after the study is running. So when we applied for the study, we couldn't apply for a study that will examine effects of psychedelics just because of the effects, but we used rather the psychotomimetic approach where we used psilocybin as a model of psychosis. So this is the clinical trial that we had to approve. Compared to other countries, we had to go through all the process of registering clinical trial, and this is the UDRA-CT number under which it is running, even though it is in healthy volunteers and there is no treatment related to it. So, as I said, we were studying or using psilocybin as a model of psychosis. This is psilocybin. That's probably something that most of you know. Psilocybin is actually a prodrug of psilocin. Psilocin is the active metabolite of psilocybin, which is metabolized already in the guts. And this is how psilocybin mushrooms look like. This is actually something that was found in Czech Republic last year. I don't know if everybody is aware here, but there's quite a lot of potent psilocybin mushrooms that are grown or that are found in our country. Okay, so let's go to the design of the study. The study had two parts. We call them EEG part, or two branches. We call them EEG branch and an fMRI branch. There were quite a lot of things that subjects underwent through each of these parts. In each of these parts, they received placebo and active dose. This is a design of the EEG study. What is interesting on this part that we recorded EEG several times over the experiment. We tried to not bother subjects with too many behavioral tasks, and so most of the measurements that we gathered through this part were passive. Compared to that, the MRI part is not that comfortable. For most people, MRI is a place which can induce anxiety, which can be related to agoraphobia and some unpleasant feelings. So we decided to use or to make the MRI part as the second in the second stage after all subjects went through placebo and psilocybin in the EEG part. And since they were also already experienced, we also included more behavioral testing during the descending phase of the intoxication. Probably everybody knows here that for the effect of psychedelics, set and setting is very, very important. That these two components are responsible for the final phenomenology of the intoxication. This is amazing when you do therapy, when you work with people. You can have a good setting, but how to make a setting which is for scientific purposes, where we bother people with a lot of things they might not be interested in. Definitely. Different setting would be taking mescaline like Johnny Depp in Fear and Laughing in Las Vegas, and old ritual place in Atacama where we experienced San Pedro ceremony years ago. So this is how our experimental room looked like. It's not a living room, it's actually in a hospital, and it's a Faraday cage decorated to be as pleasant as possible. And subjects spend most of the time in this room. Also, they have to, although they have to go for some moments to the MRI, for example, but most of the time they stay in here. This is the sample that we've already involved in the study. We had 20 volunteers, mean age was 35 years. We were not restricted to take only experienced people, so we had 7 drug-naive volunteers as well. And the average dose that we were given to subjects was varying between 18 to 23 milligrams. It was 0.26 milligrams per kilogram. So, what are the effects of psychedelics? You probably are aware there are some somatic effects which are at the beginning, typically felt like dry mouth and different sensory, somatosensory effects like shivering in the hands, cold, and so on. There are definitely sympathomimetic effects which are characteristic for serotonergic compounds. Then there are these perceptual symptoms. That's why people usually take psychedelics, to experience all of these visuals. And there are, of course, psychological effects. If you want to measure these symptoms, we have to use scales or tools to measure them. I'll just show some safety data, what psilocybin does from the somatic effects. This is effect on blood pressure and heart rate. Psilocybin slightly increases blood pressure as well as the heart rate. Nothing that would be dramatic, so no toxic effects. The sympathomimetic activity can be presented, for example, here you have a volunteer and a sitter facing the same light, and you can see a dramatic mydriasis in the volunteer, and another volunteer has anisocoria, so each of the pupils is different size. So these are sympathomimetic effects of psilocybin that can be observed. How do we measure psychological or neuropsychological effects? We can use various scales, and as I said, initially we used the psychomimetic approach. We modeled psychosis, so we used one of the scales which is typically used to measure psychopathology in patients, and we used it several times over time. What we see here in the graph, this is different subscales of this brief psychiatric rating scales, and this is what happens in time. This is pre-drug condition. We can see some anxiety at the beginning before they ingested the drug, and the main effect appears around 1 hour or 90 minutes after the ingestion, and then it gradually decreases. And how about this? This is placebo, and we also had some placebo responders that the effect wasn't so strong. The main effect of psilocybin was on the thought disturbance and hallucination scale, which definitely corresponds to what we can expect from psychedelic drug. Another important feature is if the intensity of effects correlates with the plasma levels of psilocin. We measured plasma levels of psilocin, and we definitely found a positive correlation between the effects on BPRS scale total, as well as the hallucinating subscale with the plasma levels of psilocin. The next slide is about how it might look like in comparison with other drugs. We also do some experiments with ketamine and cannabis, and you have comparison of the same scale during the peak of ketamine and cannabis, and you can see that psilocybin induces most robust effects on the third thought disturbance and hallucination subscale, similarly like ketamine, but has much less withdrawal retardation symptoms. Cannabis is much weaker compared to that. The next scale that we have used, this scale was objectively based, so the examinator evaluated the subject. The next scale that we used was the slightly older version that was presented here of Altered States of Consciousness scale, which has 3 subscales or 3 main dimensions: oceanic boundlessness, which refers mainly to the positive, pleasant effect, losing ego boundaries, and so on. Dread of ego dissolution, which refers more to the anxiety and sometimes unpleasant experiences, and of course the visionary reconstruction scale, which is referring to the visual effects. Additional scale, actually, it's the total score of all items on the scale refers to the magnitude of effects. So how did it look like with psilocybin? There was quite dramatic effect on oceanic boundlessness scale and visual reconstruction scale, so there were a lot of visual effects and a lot of pleasant effects. The total score positively correlated with the plasma levels of psilocin significantly, and again here we have a comparison how it looks like when you compare it with ketamine and cannabis. As you can see, psilocybin definitely induces more visual effects than ketamine. Approximately the same on the oceanic boundlessness scale, and much more pronounced symptoms compared to cannabis. Okay, another scale that we used and we are using for validating is hallucinogen rating scale. I don't want to talk too much about it, but I did one thing. I looked, this scale was used for, in the first studies with DMT by Rick Strassman to measure the effect the effects of DMT. And I actually took the data from his paper and I put it into the same graph as we used with psilocybin, and actually found out, what you can see here, that the effects of the dose of psilocybin we used using this scale were quite comparable, almost the same to DMT. So that refers that DMT and psilocybin are definitely very similar in inducing the behavioral effects. So we know that psychedelics induce visual effects, but there are not a lot of studies that prove directly that the subjects are visually hallucinating. And since we introduced several cognitive testing or behavioral tasks that were presented on a computer during the intoxication, we also wanted to know whether these subjects really see what they see. So we developed a very small, a very easy paradigm where we presented to subject these faces and objects that were somehow morphing. And we presented also objects and faces that were static, they didn't move. And we asked them to identify those objects and those faces that are moving or not moving. And what we have found that subjects during the peak of intoxication detected objects and faces as if they are moving, even though they were not moving. So this is a direct proof of visual perceptual changes during the peak of intoxication. We needed this test especially for emotional morphing paradigm, as you will see later on, because then the faces are morphing, and if the subject would detect the faces that are morphing, then we couldn't measure the principle of the paradigm, as you will see later. Next thing is related to music. There were some beautiful talks of Mendel about music and so on. We also test some music paradigms, but this is the initial phase where we wanted the subjects to select the music that they like the most. So we ask subjects to rate the music according to whether they like it or they dislike it. They had a visual analog scale +3 to -3, and we presented them music from wide different styles of music, from punk through hardcore through electronic music, including psytrance music and classical music. Actually, we were surprised from one thing. Psilocybin increased likelihood of all kinds of music except Sex Pistols. They may be too old, I don't know. The most interesting finding was that all people like the most classical music. They referred it as very hedonic feelings having with it. Very interesting finding was that psytrance, really hard, dark trance, increased, the liking increased during the psilocybin. Most significantly, there was like almost 2 or 3 times increased the liking of this style of music. So that forced us to use this kind of music in the future studies in the MRI, and I might tell you already that people in the MRI, it was quite opposite. They enjoyed and really liked the psytrance music, but they said the classical music with inside the magnet wasn't nothing special. Another thing which is related to perception, everybody knows that drugs affect perception of time. Cannabis slows down perception of time. Amphetamines or other stimulants, they increase the perception of time. And what psychedelic does, we don't know exactly what they do. There were some studies published already, but we used a paradigm where we asked the subject to decide whether they see on the screen a square for a time period which is closer to 1 second or closer to 3 seconds, and they had to decide whether on which direction it is. And as you see, a psilocybin shifted the curve a little bit to the right, and in fact, it means that longer intervals were perceived as shorter. So that's the effect on time perception. Finally, from the perceptive part, we did a study on emotional morphing. There were several colleagues here presenting the effect of psilocybin, that it prevents detection of the fear stimuli and the negative emotions when people are intoxicated. Actually, we used a paradigm when from normal phase, neutral phase, we let the phases morph to 6 different emotions to find out whether also other emotions are affected. And actually, the only thing we found that psilocybin affected the perception of the fear emotion. So actually the same finding as confirming the same finding as the others. I think I will skip because of the time, I will skip the evoked potentials, and I will go a little bit to the MRI findings. We know that psilocybin and other serotonergic psychedelics are affecting or acting through 2A receptors, and that the mechanism why they induce so profound changes is a combination of increased cortical excitability and decreased filtering in thalamus. And this, in fact, can lead to such complex vivid imaginaries and neuropsychological processes. So what do we saw in the MRI? This is a connectivity analysis of thalamus with the rest of the brain. And what we have found an increased connectivity of thalamus with wide cortical areas, which definitely supports this hypothesis that the flow of information from thalamus to cortex is definitely increased. The other observation we had was related to brain networks. In brain, there are several brain networks. Default mode network, which is predominantly activated during resting state, central executive network, which is mainly activated during some activational tasks. These 2 networks are normally anti-correlated, so when we are relaxed, we cannot concentrate on something in external space. So what psilocybin does, psilocybin actually increased the connectivity between default mode network and central executive networks. So it decreased the anti-correlation of these 2 networks, which means they increase more chaos in the brain, which also fits into the hypothesis of increased brain entropy. And similar findings were found already by other people. So this is the EEG part of the study. As I said at the beginning, we look on the dynamics of the EEG changes over time. This is the peak effect of psilocybin, where we've observed, like all other serotonergic psychedelics, a global decrease of alpha power in occipital regions, and we also observed an increase of gamma power in the higher frequency bands, but we cannot say this is a brain activity because it's confounded by the muscle activation. but future studies, maybe looking on theta-gamma coupling, might reveal whether this is brain activity or not. Actually, we have some data from animals which show that in temporal regions, the gamma oscillations might also increase. So this is the onset of drug effect. We move in 90 minutes, and it seems to be more localized only to alpha power. There is less gamma power decrease. 180 minutes after ingestion, there is a shift of the decrease of activation into the lower frequency bands in theta, and there is almost nothing 6 hours after the administration. Okay, so how these effects correlate to behavioral effects. In our study, we have found out that the only correlation was found for the magnitude effect on altered states of consciousness scale. There was a correlation with the alpha power decrease, and the main subscale that was responsible for that was oceanic boundlessness subscale. This is another approach. We looked on connectivity using Loretta, and what you see on this image is not significant change, or there are not significant changes, but it's a general pattern of connectivity over time that happens during the psilocybin intoxication. And as you can see here, during the peak of the effect, 50 and 90 minutes after the ingestion, there was some characteristic pattern showing disconnection in alpha band, and compared to that, increase in connectivity in all other frequency bands. However, over time, it shifted to another state, and at 6 hours after the administration, there was reversal of the connectivity pattern in the alpha band and in the delta band. So it seems like the brain shifts to another state through the intoxication. Skip this because of running out of time. One of the final slides are related to entropy. Robin Garhardt described that psychedelics during the peak of intoxication increase the brain entropy, and that this increase of brain entropy might be a factor that is responsible for the prolonged effects of psychedelics, that the brain state remains in high entropy. I was thinking about this hypothesis, and there is one issue which is slightly different. Most of the studies that were held today were held in a controlled setting, and most of the subjects who went through the study had positive experiences, long-term experiences with psychedelics. But when we look on the reality, a lot of people take drugs on parties, on raves, and many of them suffer after taking psychedelics from anxiety or from some unpleasant side effects. So is it always like that we have to get to a high entropic state and having only positive effects after psychedelics? Well, actually, I'm not sure. This is a picture from Peru, where we were traveling last year, and beautiful landscape. But let's have a look what might happen. This is one pathway you can select in the mountains, and you will walk through this pathway, and you will get to some places where you have a lot of view around on the top of the mountains. You will have high energy, as systems which are higher have higher energy. Then you might get to places with lower energy, lower entropy over the path, and not from each part you can see all the other paths, so you cannot predict what's on other states. But there are several other paths in the mountains which can be connected and doesn't have to be connected. And they have their local minima and local maxima, and each of them might be very different. For example, from this local maxima, from this local minima, you wouldn't even know that there is some local maxima somewhere else. And my feeling is that psychedelics can take you through the experience to different brain states in which they might exist. So people who are experiencing bad experiences might not find finally the local minima where they would feel safe, and might stay somewhere high in the mountains overnight and being in an unpleasant state. And actually, this is something what's shown in our data a little bit, that 6 hours after the administration of psilocybin, the brain shifts through one state to a different state. And the question is whether this can be tested in the future, and we're planning experiments looking at the brain activity over time and the next day after the ingestion. So finally, about the safety, we had a quite safe environment, I would say, because all the subjects reported finally that they enjoyed the experience, and 1 month follow-up showed that there was positive effects in all the subjects that we had in the study. So I skipped the summary and conclusions, and I would like to thank to the team that participated on these studies, and I would like to thank you goodbye with the words of one of the volunteers who's actually sitting here, who had a very interesting experience. So thank you for your attention.
Hi, you flashed by the exclusion criteria pretty quickly, but I saw left-handedness, and I haven't ever seen that before. Could you share some info about that?
Well, the left-handedness is there because when we do imaging studies, we want to the subject activate on the same part of the brain. So that's unfortunately that's the exclusion. If you would have enough people with left-handedness, might be interesting study to compare.
I was wondering if you might be able to briefly cover the evoked potential stuff you skipped over.
Sorry, I don't hear you.
Oh, I was wondering if you might be able to briefly cover the evoked potential slide that you skipped over.
Okay, you want to see it?
Yeah.
Can I? Do we have time? Yeah? Okay, we did, I won't go into the base of evoked potentials, but we did mismatch negativity and P300. And what we have found that psilocybin was an auditory audible paradigm, and it was measured during the peak of intoxication, and psilocybin disrupted P300. It was significantly negatively correlated with these subscales of altered states of consciousness scales, and we didn't find an effect on mismatch negativity, so we confirmed the finding of Umbrecht, even though we measured it in a slightly different moment during the intoxication. What was interesting, we also found significant effect on N100, so the attentive as well as the pre-attentive as well as the sensory processing. The attentive as sensory processing were affected, but the pre-attentive, which is represented by mismatch negativity, was not affected. Wow. Not my fault.
As somebody who lives, eats, and breathes electronic dance music, when you mentioned the post-rave syndrome, my interest was obviously very piqued. I'm sure plenty of people in the room can relate to it in one way or another. But on a very serious note, I'm interested to know, you said you have some follow-ups planned. That sort of reintegration might happen in like a shaman-led ceremony or something. It doesn't happen when people are using these drugs recreationally to enhance their experience at a rave or listening to music on their own. So I would love to hear a little bit more about what you have planned there.
Like follow up on the music or follow up of the study?
Of the study you mentioned.
Okay, well, the only follow-up we did was that was included in the clinical trial was the persisting effect scale, the same that Rolando Griffiths used, which is 1 month after each measurement. If we are planning to re-interview some of these subjects to do some follow-up study, but for now it's not included in the clinical trial, so we have to respect the design of the trial.
Future trial. Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the. Okay, they had two.
Okay, thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering, so you have results that show psilocybin interfering with perception of fearful faces. You also had a face morphing task to test the visual perception of those faces. I'm wondering if you looked at correlations between performance on those two tasks to see if participants who more hallucinated the faces in the morphing task had a higher percentage of the fearful faces eliminated from their perception.
Well, actually, we performed the morphing task on the descending phase. It was almost 4 hours after the ingestion, and at the time they recognized correctly whether the objects and faces were static or moving. So that's why we implemented there, not to be confounded by the visionary imaginary that might be present during the peak, which might confound the morphing paradigm. So they were not, they didn't fail in the hallucinating paradigm not to be able to participate on morphing paradigm.
Okay, thank you.
So on those lag coherence charts, was the change at 6 hours compared to baseline or compared to the last time point?
This is compared to placebo. That was compared to placebo, the data shown there. So
okay. So
yep.
at 6 hours compared to placebo, the alpha coherence was going down?
I do not have this analysis baseline compared to the last state, because these are preliminary data and we will process it, but this is compared the 6 hours after placebo, 6 hours after psilocybin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.